One evening in the late 1940s, in a small club in New York, Billie Holiday sat alone in the back row, and before Louis Armstrong had even finished the song, someone near her noticed she was crying. The club was the kind of place that existed in dozens of versions across Manhattan during those years, small enough that the stage was barely raised above the floor, dim enough that faces in the back rows dissolved into shadow, and loud enough most nights that a single quiet moment could pass completely unnoticed. The tables were close together, the air thick with cigarette smoke that curled slowly toward a ceiling stained from years of it, and the walls were lined with photographs of performers who had played there over the years, their faces barely visible in the low light. On this particular night, the room was fuller than usual, drawn by word that Louis Armstrong would be sitting in with the house band for a short, informal set, the kind of appearance that wasn't advertised, wasn't reviewed, and existed mostly in the memories of whoever happened to be there. Billie Holiday arrived late, slipping into a table near the back, away from the stage lights, the way she often did when she wanted to listen without being seen listening. She wore a simple dark coat, her hair pulled back. Nothing about her appearance suggesting she was anyone in particular, which, in a room like this, late at night, was often exactly the point. She had come, by most accounts, simply to hear music, not to perform, not to be recognized, just to sit in a dark room and let someone else's voice fill the space for a while. To understand why this particular night mattered, it helps to understand where both of these performers stood in their lives at that moment. By the late 1940s, Louis Armstrong was in the middle of one of the biggest transitions of his career. The large big bands that had defined his sound for nearly 2 decades were becoming too expensive, too unwieldy, too out of step with where popular music was heading. Touring with a full orchestra meant payrolls, travel costs, and logistics that had grown harder to justify as the entertainment industry shifted around him. Within a year or two, Armstrong would step away from leading a big band entirely and form a smaller group, the kind of intimate ensemble that would let him return to the more personal, conversational style of playing he had grown up with in New Orleans, trading the size of his sound for the depth of it. But on this night, he was still somewhere in between, a man whose name filled concert halls, sitting in, almost casually, with a small group in a club that held maybe 100 people, playing the kind of set that felt less like a performance and more like a homecoming. For Armstrong, nights like this had become rare. Most of his performances by this point came with expectations, audiences who had paid for tickets, promoters who had built advertisements around his name, schedules that left little room for anything unplanned. A small club, a house band, no advance notice. This was closer to the world he had come from than the world he now lived in, closer to the riverboats and small rooms of his earliest years than to the theaters and radio broadcasts of his current fame. Those who knew him said he played differently on nights like this, looser, quieter in places where a bigger show might have called for more, as if he too was listening to something, not just performing it. Billie Holiday, meanwhile, was in a far more difficult stretch of her life and career. By the late 1940s, she had already become one of the most distinctive voices in American music, a singer whose phrasing influenced an entire generation of vocalists, whose recordings of songs like Strange Fruit had carried weight far beyond the world of jazz clubs, into conversations about justice and dignity that most popular music of the era never touched. But these years were also marked by struggle, personal difficulties, legal troubles, and the simple exhaustion of a life lived almost entirely on stages and in train cars between cities had begun to take a visible toll. Those close to her described someone who, more and more, sought out quiet corners of rooms rather than the center of them. Someone who, even while remaining one of the most powerful performers of her generation, had begun to need music as something to receive, not only something to give. A night off for Billie Holiday increasingly meant finding a dark table in someone else's club rather than standing under her own lights. It was in this state of mind that she sat down at a table near the back of the club that night, ordered something to drink, and waited for the music to start. The set began the way these informal nights often did. A few standards, a blues number, the house band finding its footing with an unexpected guest beside them. Armstrong, trumpet in hand, moved easily between songs, his voice carrying the same warmth in this small room that it carried in concert halls 10 times the size. For much of the early set, the room responded the way rooms always responded to him, with laughter, with applause, with the easy energy of an audience enjoying itself, glasses raised, conversations pausing and resuming between numbers. And then, partway through the set, Armstrong began a song that changed the atmosphere of the room almost immediately. The song was "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" a number Armstrong had been associated with for years, originally written for a Broadway revue more than a decade earlier, a song that, on the surface, carried the structure of a typical blues number, but underneath carried something else entirely. It was a song about being overlooked, about carrying pain that the rest of the world chose not to see, about smiling through something that had nothing to do with happiness. Armstrong had performed it many times before, in many rooms, often turning it into something closer to comedy in the way he delivered certain lines, a choice that, depending on the night and the room, could land as humor or as something far more complicated, a survival strategy as much as a performance choice. On this night, in this small room, he didn't play it for laughs. Those who were close enough to the stage remembered the shift happening gradually, not a dramatic change, but a narrowing. The band played quieter, the drummer easing off until the brushes on the snare were barely audible. Armstrong's voice, usually so big it seemed to fill a room without effort, pulled back into something smaller, rougher, more private, as though he were singing to himself and the room simply happened to be close enough to hear. The trumpet, when it came in, didn't soar the way it often did. It stayed low, almost conversational, each note placed carefully, as if Armstrong were speaking directly to one or two people, rather than performing for a room full of strangers. It was somewhere in the middle of this song that someone sitting near Billie Holiday's table noticed she had gone very still. She wasn't moving, wasn't reaching for her drink, wasn't doing any of the small things people do in a crowded room to seem occupied. She was simply sitting, facing the stage, her hands resting on the table in front of her, and in the low light, the person beside her realized that her face was wet, that she had been crying quietly for some time, in a way that suggested she either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared whether anyone else did. No one said anything. No one pointed. No one whispered to a neighbor. No one did anything that might have turned a private moment into a public one. The unspoken understanding in rooms like this, among musicians, among the kind of audience that came specifically to listen rather than to be seen, was that some moments belonged only to the person having them. The waiter passed by without stopping. The people at the next table kept their eyes on the stage. Whatever was happening at that table near the back was allowed to simply happen, without comment, without attention. What exactly Billie Holiday heard in that song, on that night, is something no account has ever fully explained, and perhaps something she never fully explained even to herself. But those who knew both performers well enough to guess pointed to something simple: the song's subject, The gap between how a person is seen and what they're actually carrying was not an abstract idea to either of them. Both Armstrong and Holiday had spent their careers being watched by audiences who saw, most of the time, only the parts of them that were easiest to enjoy. The warmth, the smile, the voice that made a room feel good. What audiences rarely saw, and what this song spoke to directly, was everything underneath that. The years of travel, the unequal treatment that shadowed even their greatest triumphs, the private exhaustion that never made it into a review. For Billie Holiday, sitting in the dark, hearing Louis Armstrong sing those words not as a joke, not as a showpiece, but as something quiet and real, may have been the first time in a long while that someone else's performance had said something she had spent years trying to say herself, in different words, in different songs, to rooms that didn't always understand what she meant. It was, perhaps, less about the surprise of hearing the song, and more about the relief of hearing someone else carry, for just a few minutes, a weight she usually carried alone. The song ended quietly. There was applause, warm, appreciative, the kind any well-loved performer received in a room like this, but nothing that suggested the room at large had noticed anything unusual. The set continued. Armstrong moved into another number, lighter this time, the band picking up the tempo, and the energy of the room gradually returned to where it had been, glasses refilled, conversations resuming. Billie Holiday remained at her table for a while longer. She didn't approach the stage. She didn't speak to Armstrong that night, as far as any account suggests. She simply sat, composed herself, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and eventually slipped out of the club the same quiet way she had arrived, unnoticed by most of the room, remembered only by the handful of people seated close enough to have seen what happened. In the years that followed, neither Armstrong nor Holiday ever spoke publicly about this particular night. It exists almost entirely in the memory of those who happened to be in that room. A small, unrecorded moment between two of the most important voices in American music. A moment that never became part of either of their official stories, and yet, for those who witnessed it, became one of the most vivid things they remembered about either performer. More vivid, in some ways, than the performances that made the papers. What makes the moment matter, looking back, isn't that it reveals some hidden secret about either artist. It's simpler than that. It's a reminder that the people whose voices filled concert halls and record players across the country were, in rooms like this one, still capable of being moved themselves. That the same song could be, for one person, a performance, and for another, sitting quietly in the dark, something closer to recognition. Louis Armstrong spent his life giving audiences a version of joy that felt effortless, even when it wasn't. Billie Holiday spent her life giving audiences a version of sorrow that felt inevitable, even when it cost her everything to deliver it. On this one night, in a small room that no review ever mentioned, those two things met. Not on a stage, not in a studio, but in the space between a song and the person it was meant for. And somewhere in that small, dark club, for the length of one song, the distance between performer and audience disappeared entirely, leaving just two people who understood, without a word passing between them, exactly what the other one had been carrying all along.